Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third annual symposium of our Firearm Safety Among Children and Teens Consortium. I'm Rebecca Cunningham, the Vice President for Research here at the University of Michigan and a Professor of Emergency Medicine and Public Health. I'm excited to join you all today and to learn more how researchers nationwide are advancing the science of firearm injury prevention. Before we begin, I should remind everyone that this session is being recorded and you will see a live transcript at the bottom of your screen. If you want to hide this, you can do that by clicking the transcript icon. It's pretty incredible to think that just a few years ago, a symposium like this would not have been possible. Polarization around this topic has resulted in limited science, minimal research funding, and a dearth of faculty scholars focused on the field of study. But I am so pleased to see that this field, our field, is truly beginning to grow and thrive. The quality of science is increasing every year, and that is evident by today's expansive agenda. We want to highlight more of the incredibly rigorous science submissions that we received this year. Perhaps next year we will need to host a two-day conference. The expansion of our field certainly is a direct result of increased investments to support firearm injury prevention research nationwide and your efforts. The expansion is a reflection of the expertise, commitment, and passion of each of you exhibit on a daily basis towards this work. We entered this field to make a difference, and so regardless of what institution you belong to, I'm pleased to call you my colleagues here today. It is definitely going to require the efforts of everyone across our institutions across the country to address this public health crisis. Many of the researchers who are presenting today are the recipients of recent federal awards from the CDC and NIH that are focused specifically on firearm injury prevention. This reflects a commitment at the federal level to applying our most rigorous science to a problem that claims more than 100 lives each day in the United States. We are pleased to announce that leaders from the CDC and NIH are here with us today. I am pleased that that little federal budget issue got sorted so they could indeed join us. Thank you for your support and your commitment to reducing firearm injuries and deaths. This afternoon, our partners from the federal government will share with us their research priorities and funding opportunities so that together we can move our field forward. We're honored to have these leaders here today, and I'm certain you will benefit from their insights. I'm also pleased to share that in June, the University of Michigan launched a new Institute for Firearm Injury Prevention. With a $10 million University of Michigan commitment over the next 5 years, we have an incredible opportunity to generate new knowledge and advance innovative solutions and training that ultimately will reduce firearm injuries and deaths. Today's symposium is presented in partnership with the U of M Institute. I will soon introduce you to its co-director, Dr. Pat Carter, who will share more details about the Institute and how it can formulate and answer critical questions around safety and violence. There's a lot of great momentum happening in this space, both here and nationally, but there's certainly a lot of work yet to be done. Increased research investments are a step in the right direction, but the stark reality is that we all must come to grips with this public health crisis is unfortunately growing more intense every year. And that's why today's symposium is so essential. The expertise of everybody here is tremendous. If we truly want to advance this field, we need to focus on educating and training a diverse next generation of faculty and students. And we need to explore firearm injuries across the lifespan. This includes suicide, community and school-based violence, domestic violence, peer violence, police violence, as well as the disparities in susceptibility to firearm injuries by race, gender, geographic location, and socioeconomic status. To meet the challenges of tomorrow, we need better data, more diverse and interdisciplinary perspectives at the table, and institutional and federal commitments to advance academic research nationally. Today's research presentations will not only demonstrate the progress of our field, they will highlight the key gaps and inform our next steps to advance more effective and equitable prevention across the country. Today, some leading experts in the field will share emergent findings, data, and innovations that aim to increase the quality of our science and advance a variety of important issues. Today's research presentations include, but are not limited to, the impacts of structural racism and police violence, expert guidance for building a more comprehensive US firearm data infrastructure, results from rigorous evaluations of firearm policies, opportunities for enhancing prevention in healthcare and community settings, and interdisciplinary flash science on a range of topics from risk assessment to the impacts of COVID-19. I'm excited for these topics today, and I hope you'll stay with us for the full day. I am now pleased to introduce Dr. Carter, co-director of the University of Michigan Institute for Firearm Injury Prevention, so that he can share more about the new institute in our day together. Welcome, Dr. Carter.
Thank you, Dr. Cunningham, for that kind introduction. I also want to welcome everyone to the third annual FACS Symposium. As Dr. Cunningham mentioned, I'm Pat Carter, and I'll be serving as the moderator for the first half of the day today. Today's conference is co-sponsored by the FACS Consortium and the new University of Michigan Institute for Firearm Injury Prevention. I wanted to take a minute to talk a little bit about this new institute, which is really an exciting development here at the university as well as for our field. This new institute is a multidisciplinary institute focused on the science of firearm injury prevention occurring across the lifespan. It includes work focused in the areas of firearm suicide, community violence, intimate partner violence, school and mass shootings, unintentional firearm injuries, and police violence. This new institute will expand on the work that we've done with our FACS Consortium and will now focus on firearm injuries occurring across both pediatric and adult populations. This institute will focus on fueling innovation and fostering interdisciplinary collaboration with faculty experts across the university campus in various forms of research and scholarship, including through a pilot program that's intended to stimulate large-scale research. The Institute will also work to expand vital data resources critical to our work, such as expanding our data repository begun with the FACS Consortium to include adult data sets. In addition, the Institute, as we have done with FACS, will engage the voices and perspectives of stakeholders across multiple disciplines and sectors. This includes firearm owners to religious and school leaders to injury prevention advocates. Will all have a voice in the new Institute and will all be integrated into the work that we do moving forward. We've already seen the Institute build momentum over the past month. With the receipt of two federal awards, one from the CDC to the Michigan Youth Violence Prevention Center, and one to Dr. Justin Heinze for work on prevention of firearm violence in Detroit. I also am excited to share that as part of the work of this new institute, we have recently posted for 3 tenure-track faculty positions across multiple levels of leadership and experience, and we encourage you to share these opportunities widely. And encourage anyone who's interested to apply for the positions. We look forward to updating you on the work of this institute annually, as well as on the collaborations with other universities moving forward. Today, we have an exciting opportunity to learn from the experts across our field. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. We've disabled the chat feature for this conference, but you'll have the opportunity to ask questions through the Q&A function, and we do encourage you to use the Q&A function throughout the speakers' talks so that the questions will populate in for the end of each session. If you have any technical issues during the day and need assistance, please email facs-team@umich.edu. We have research assistants monitoring this and we'll be able to help you throughout the day if you run into problems. At this time, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker for the morning. Dr. Rod Brunson is a professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Maryland. He is a widely sought after speaker who's received numerous professional awards in recognition of his distinguished body of scholarly work. Dr. Brunson co-directs the Racial Democracy, Crime and Justice Network, which is comprised of social scientists conducting research on crime, inequality, and the criminal justice system. Professor Brunson's expertise centers on police community relations, youth violence, and evidence-based criminal justice policy. He has consistently called for effective crime reduction strategies that do not result in racially disparate treatment of minority citizens and disadvantaged neighborhoods. His scholarship has appeared in an array of publications across multiple disciplines, including the Annual Review of Sociology, the British Journal of Criminology, Criminology and Public Policy, Justice Quarterly, Urban Affairs Review, and Urban Health. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brunson for his talk.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carter, for that warm introduction. I'd like to say good morning to everyone and to say that I'm extremely honored to kick off today's research symposium and look forward to hearing from and learning from fellow presenters as well as from the broader FACS community. I've organized the time that I've been so generously given today into 3 sections. So I'll start with a discussion of how over and under policing contribute to racial disparities in the criminal justice system and various outcomes. Second, I'll have a presentation of some study findings from a recently completed study in New York City involving high-risk victims and perpetrators of gun violence. And I'll conclude with the brief introduction of an upcoming study involving 5 violent Chicago neighborhoods. Next slide, please. On May 25th, 2020, George Floyd, an unarmed 46-year-old Black man, died after lying under the weight of a Minneapolis police officer's knee for a reported 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Before passing away, Floyd squirmed in pain on the pavement and unsuccessfully pled with the 4 officers for life-saving aid, repeatedly warning, "I can't breathe." Grotesque images of this encounter were captured on a bystander's smartphone and quickly went viral, reigniting enduring racial tensions concerning an ever-expanding list of Black lives lost to questionable police actions. In conjunction with the COVID-19 pandemic, scenes of Floyd's murder again brought broader racial inequities to the forefront of many Americans' minds. Hospitalization and death rates were significantly higher for Black, Hispanic, Asian, and American Indians. Blacks and Hispanics were also disproportionately experiencing job loss. These factors acted as the undercurrent, and horrific deaths of Black men and women at the hands of the police were catalysts for subsequent protests. Next slide, please. Floyd's killing resulted in nationwide and global street protests at a scale not seen since the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968. Interestingly, Martin Luther King famously asserted that riots are the language of the unheard. Several civil rights leaders proclaimed that public backlash surrounding Floyd's death seemed different than preceding high-profile tragedies. Not only did his murder mobilize a racially diverse coalition of social justice advocates, but activist demands for criminal justice reform have been all-encompassing, from sweeping public safety demands, demands for greater economic equality, political mobilization, and calls to defund or dissolve police departments. The Defund the Police movement gained traction with several groups pushing for police reform, including the Black Lives Matter movement. Next slide, please. Those early demands, understandably, may have stemmed from anger, fear, and emotional fatigue regarding historical racial oppression. In the early days, there were few shared definitions of divestment or abolition, in addition to few clear strategies for pursuing these goals. Initial calls to defund the police eventually coalesced around the idea of redirecting public funds to social service organizations so that frontline officers would no longer be responsible for public safety functions that might best be handled by other trained professionals. Next slide, please. A Pew Research Center survey has demonstrated waning support for Black Lives Matter among white and Hispanic adults, although Black and Asians' support remains relatively strong. Police unions have asserted that officers are increasingly reluctant to carry out their sworn duties because of unwarranted public scrutiny, departmental discipline, or politically motivated criminal prosecutions. Longstanding mistrust of the police among many Black citizens has been incorrectly interpreted as their disdain for the policing profession. Next slide, please. So how do Black residents of distressed urban communities actually feel about the police? In reality, people of color living in challenging social conditions often implore municipal leaders for more effective policing and public safety initiatives, which include increased police presence. In addition to reporting grave concern about their physical safety, Black citizens often lament that those responsible for implementing crime control strategies lack compassion. In a recently co-authored study appearing in Criminology and Public Policy, which I'm happy to provide links later, my co-author and I note that residents are sometimes incorrectly portrayed as tolerant of persistent crime and disorder. And police relations with Black citizens are admittedly historically complex and fragile. They require a nuanced analysis that humanizes both parties, an approach that is sorely missing from contemporary public discourse. An improved understanding of this relationship is possible, however, by exploring the attitudes and expectations that members of each group bring to emotionally charged encounters. Next slide, please. Mischaracterizations of lawful protests against longstanding biases in the criminal justice system as unpatriotic potentially deepen our nation's partisan and racial divides, undercutting opportunities for meaningful police reform. Unsupported claims of pervasive anti-police sentiments among Blacks are not only harmful, but they also potentially appeal to whites' racialized fear that increased crime will result from any police reform efforts. Now, this narrative is especially dangerous for law-abiding residents of disadvantaged Black communities, places where violent crime is disproportionately concentrated and effective policing desperately needed. Following the 1965 Watts riots, Municipal Judge Lauren Miller said, "The people distrust the police and the police distrust the people. They both move in a constant atmosphere of hate." More research-informed initiatives are necessary if we ever want to change this dynamic. Otherwise, urban Black residents will continue to feel both unprotected and aggressively policed, and officers will continue to feel threatened, especially as their legitimacy further erodes with each publicized incident in which a Black citizen dies at the hands of the police. Next slide, please. Work by David Klinger, Rob Kane, and other policing scholars has shown that neighborhood social and physical conditions affect officers' perceptions of potential danger, and that the ethnic makeup of communities matters when rolling out policing strategies, especially order maintenance ones, which are predicated on the belief that serious crime, like gun violence, might be prevented if officers devote more attention to arresting those who commit minor offenses, like loitering, panhandling, or defacing public property with graffiti. But critics of such proactive policing warn that hassling these low-level offenders only serves to worsen racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Next slide, please. Thankfully, there's quite a bit of scholarship that supports the theory that officers who are perceived as executing their duties in a procedurally just manner are more likely to be viewed by citizens as legitimate. That is to say, people are more likely to obey the law when they're convinced that officers possess moral authority. In fact, citizens might even tolerate unfavorable outcomes like traffic tickets or arrests if they believe that officers were impartial in their decision-making. On the other hand, citizens might appear hostile, resentful, and be mistrustful if they feel that they are targeted by unnecessary police attention. So we can see that many of the same environmental conditions that are related to over-policing also contribute to wariness with ineffective policing among residents of high crime neighborhoods, leading them to claim that disadvantaged Black neighborhoods are simultaneously over and under policed. Allegations of under policing centering around perceptions of poor service delivery, such as slow response times, discourtesy from officers, displays of apathy, and counting and mounting unsolved murders, while officers simultaneously over-police for minor offenses. Together, these lead to frustration from members of the community. Next slide, please. The calculus that officers use to distinguish between law-abiding and law-violating individuals is imperfect at best, and is further complicated by officers' shared views of where and with whom dangers may lie. These interactions are further complicated by the understandably distinct opinions that young Black males bring to them, stemming from frequent complaints of police harassment and mistreatment. In a study published in Urban Affairs Review in 2009, my colleague and I found that race is important here, in that we examined young Black and white males' interactions with the police, and we found that young white men report unwanted police attention in a more narrow set of circumstances than their Black counterparts. For example, when they were in the company of Black males, when they were in racially mixed or majority Black neighborhoods, or when they were dressed in hip hop apparel. Further, in a British Journal of Criminology article in 2006, my colleague and I found that Black male adolescents viewed the police wrongdoing as multifaceted, not only intimately tied to their status as young Black men in disadvantaged communities, but nonetheless, ultimately and inescapably about race. Given aggressive law enforcement strategies and beliefs that both officers and Black citizens bring to tense encounters, we're perhaps fortunate that lethal clashes between them do not occur more often. These issues are exemplified by the socialization processes of many Black youth. That is, Black parents and other elders feel compelled to discuss law enforcement etiquette with Black young people in the hope of keeping them safe during involuntary police encounters. Interestingly, we don't have any evidence that white adults also try to armor white youth about police violence. So we see, once again, that Blacks and whites live in vastly different social worlds, such that it's difficult for social scientists to disentangle the impact of race from attributes of disadvantaged communities in general in explaining police practices. We only have to look to the January 6th Capitol attacks, which serve as a clear example of differences in police responses to violence. Next slide, please. The death of Michael Brown in 2014 acted not only as a flashpoint for simmering US race relations, it was also one of the first in a series of disparate deaths that served as a catalyst for collective action. I'm sure that you've all heard their names by now: Eric Garner, Freddie Gray, Walter Scott, Breonna Taylor, Dante Wright, and unfortunately, so many more. The movement that has come to be known as Black Lives Matter is at the forefront of this collective action, arising from grassroots activism in 2012 after the death of Trayvon Martin at the hands of George Zimmerman. Black Lives Matter has a considerable social media presence and political platform, and they employ revolutionary language and impromptu acts of civil disobedience. Black Lives Matter protesters intentionally seek to disturb the peace in the hope of heightening their social justice agenda, asserting that without such actions, mainstream America will continue to ignore issues disproportionately and adversely impacting Black lives. In response to public shock over the lack of accurate national data on deadly police shootings, in 2015, the Washington Post and Guardian newspapers both began gathering and sharing statistics on fatal police shootings. There are also independently maintained websites that collect and make publicly available data on police killings, for example, killedbypolice.net and fatalencounters.org. Also in 2015, the US Department of Justice announced that it will begin compiling national data on officer-involved shootings. But despite launching a pilot program in 2017, the promise of a nationwide standardized database remains unfulfilled. The Washington Post estimated that since between 2007 and 2012, the FBI undercounted fatal police shootings by as much as 50% because individual departments are not mandated to report. And sadly, many do not. We know, of course, that there's a disproportionate use of lethal force against Blacks and to a lesser degree Hispanics. However, with a remarkably stable yearly toll of just over 1,000 victims per year. American police kill citizens at a rate at least a dozen times that of in, for example, England, Western Europe, and Scandinavian countries. This difference from other advanced industrial countries in police shootings undoubtedly has to do, at least in part, with the abundance of guns in private hands in the United States, more than one per person, by contrast with their rarity in other nations. In fact, state rates of police killings of civilians are correlated with state rates of gun ownership. Next slide, please. Racial disproportionality is the problem within the problem. The Washington Post database of police killings since 2015 shows that of the 5,865 victims as of December 2020, 26% of the people fatally shot by the police were Black, even though Blacks are only 13% of the US population. Whites, on the other hand, constitute 51% of those killed by police, but represent 60% of the US population. These statistics correspond to rates of death by police gunfire of 14 per million for whites and 34 per million for Blacks, nearly 2.5 times the white rate. Next slide, please. Contrary to a widely held belief about police killings, most people killed by the police are armed at the time of the incident. In the Post data, 60% of both Black and white victims were reported to have a gun at the time of the incident, and nearly 90% of victims had some sort of weapon, for example, a knife, vehicle, or a toy weapon resembling a gun. Here again, though a racial disparity is evident, of the 1,407 Blacks killed in this period, 9% were unarmed, in contrast with 5.8% of the 2,697 whites killed. Next slide. At a minimum, three factors must be considered. First, we must look at the rate at which police shoot Black versus white citizens within police encounters. Second, we need to consider a possible disproportion in the rate at which police have encounters with Blacks as compared to whites. And third, how much of that disproportion, if it exists, can in turn be ascribed to Black and white differences in rates of offending, as well as how much can be attributed to unconscious or conscious police biases. Of course, this data is heavily dependent on administrators, police administrators and officials who gather, maintain, and contextualize the data that is provided. Without reliable systematic data on the frequency of police-citizen encounters, both fatal and non-fatal, as well as other types of lethal force, scholars can only offer limited scientific guidance regarding how much of the disparity in police killings of Black citizens can be attributed to racial bias. In turn, these limitations on social science research greatly hindered the efforts of policymakers who are trying to respond to fervent calls for police reform. These data limitations are also complicated by the proliferation of smartphones that allow bystanders to record dubious police encounters via live stream or immediately post them to social media. Although having camera phones in the hands of the public provides increased police accountability, it may also inadvertently distort public opinion regarding how often and under what conditions officers are most likely to use lethal force. Next slide, please. As we move forward toward reform, those jurisdictions where officers exhibit greater restraint in the use of deadly force should be modeled, and those who engage in patterns and practice of excessive use of force should be held accountable. There should be requisite, systematic, and comprehensive official data regarding lethal and non-lethal officer-involved shootings. Otherwise, again, we cannot fully explore whether or not there are differences in how officers discharge their weapons at Black versus white citizens. Next slide, please. In the entertainer Ice Cube's 1992 song, which references motorist Rodney King's videotape beating by LA police officers in 1991, the artist decries various forms of police brutality that he might have experienced during a traffic stop involving the Los Angeles Police Department, before sadly concluding, but if I had a camera, the shit wouldn't matter. This sobering sentiment is one routinely expressed by many Black citizens who have come to view the criminal justice system as yet another white supremacist regime that has not only routinely failed them, but was never intended to protect Black bodies and deliver justice to their communities. The patterns of discriminatory policing highlighted today strike an especially strident chord with those Black citizens who view contemporary policing strategies through the historical lens of slave patrols, mob action, torture, and countless killings of free Blacks. Even today, Black citizens must endure the surveilling and limitation of their physical movement. Pundits have frequently referred to George Floyd's murder as a critical inflection point for beleaguered U.S. race relations. Mr. Floyd's gut-wrenching death, which is resulting barrage of corporate statements condemning racism, together with new leadership in Washington that unapologetically campaigned on meaningful criminal justice system reform, offers a critical opportunity for change. Specifically, the Biden-Harris administration could reform the Department of Justice by focusing on bolstering citizen confidence in three specific ways. First, they could more firmly embrace evidence-based crime policy. Next, they could mandate effective police accountability measures. And third, they could develop a nationwide database based on mandatory police reporting, documenting a wide range of police citizens encounters. We as a nation no longer have the luxury of waiting for yet another blue ribbon panel to issue policy recommendations that, like nearly all of the 59 guidelines that were issued by the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing in 2015 were ignored by the next administration. The camera, as Ice Cube has said, has made vivid to the whole nation a reality that has far too often been known directly by some minority communities. The bundle of police-related laws enacted by states in the wake of George Floyd's killing reflects this growth in public recognition of the need for reform, even if we lack consensus on the details of that reform. Nonetheless, high-quality research by social scientists can and should play a central role in providing these details. Next slide, please. So next, I'd like to transition to a study, as I alluded to in the opening, that was conducted in New York from May through December 2017. Our research team conducted face-to-face interviews with 108 New York residents of Brooklyn and the Bronx. We later restricted our focus to a subsample of 50 young Black men between the ages of 18 and 29, with a mean age of 20.9. These were all residents of high crime neighborhoods who had considerable knowledge about illegal gun carrying and the resulting bloodshed. Our study findings confirmed that distress settings reliably failed to produce cooperative witnesses due to the cumulative impact of anti-snitching norms, fear of retaliation, legal cynicism, and high-risk victims viewed toward self-help. Next slide, please. Almost half of our study participants reported having a friend or a family member who was a victim of gun violence. And importantly, 74% of those that we interviewed expressed having been victims of gun violence themselves. So together, this is a group with extensive knowledge about New York City illegal gun markets and the resulting violence. So I want to step back a little bit. Next slide, please. I want to step back a little bit and talk about how we went about conducting this research, as I think is important. So as we could probably agree, effective policing is crucial to high crime communities. And part of that is that we should recognize that we need input and collaboration with those high-risk communities when conducting research on their behalf. So our research team took a purposeful approach to establishing rapport with a wide range of stakeholders in the communities that we were interested in, that included social service agencies, the clergy, neighborhood-based liaisons, and potential respondents. Members of the interview team engaged in a series of relationship-building activities for an entire year prior to starting data collection. And these activities included canvassing study neighborhoods alongside outreach workers and violence interrupters, organizing writing and career development workshops for high-risk individuals, and attending local violence rallies immediately following fatal and non-fatal shootings. Our research team members also participated in a wide range of community events that included health and wellness expos, block parties, field trips for youth enrolled in an employment program, and food drives for nearby homeless shelters. Again, all of this prior to conducting any data collection. So I want to return to some of the findings. Next slide, please. So we found that members of high crime communities believe that sustainable public safety initiatives should focus on three things, and importantly, three things that are aided by the police. The first, reducing gun violence. The second, they were adamant that we should use intermediaries to launch grassroots campaigns that counter pro-violence and anti-snitching norms. And third, improving police minority community relations. Next slide. So again, remember that almost half of our study participants reported having a friend or a family member who was a victim of gun violence, with an average of 9.3 known shooting victims. Again, 74% of our study participants reported having been victims of gun violence themselves. So in total, these were high-risk individuals, along with members of their kinship and friendship networks, who expressed to us that they had real-world reasons for not coming forward with information as it relates to police and violence in their communities, which are often shaped by cultural and community dynamics. There was a widespread mistrust of police, which stemmed from over and under policing, and these things together continue to proliferate in their communities. Next slide, please. So several of our study participants reported having had firsthand negative police interactions, such as being threatened with violence, including potentially lethal violence. Many of our study participants expressed frustration with NYPD's emphasis on low-level crimes, arguing that the police were more interested in enforcing drug crimes or harassing residents rather than apprehending those who were responsible for neighborhood violence. So again, as we see, over and under policing can gradually chip away at police legitimacy. For example, community members who we spoke with talked about frequently observing murder suspects proudly walking through the neighborhood at the same time that they saw police harassing community members for minor offenses. Next slide, please. Mistrust of police is demonstrated in part by a lack of the cooperation in shooting investigations that I mentioned earlier. So our study participants, overwhelmingly, 92%, reported that they would not call the police if they or a loved one were ever threatened with a gun. Interestingly, respondents were not concerned about being caught by the police with guns. Instead, they were more worried about being caught by their enemies without them. Next slide, please. Marlon, one of our study participants, succinctly captured this reality. So Marlon was a 23-year-old prior shooting victims from the Bronx. And he said that carrying a gun is for safety, because once you got a person that you know is coming for you for whatever reason, you got to protect yourself. You're not just going to let anybody walk up on you and shoot you up because you're scared to hold a gun or you don't want to go to jail. I don't want to die. That's how some people think. I don't want to die. I'd rather break the law, go to jail, not to die. I'm still alive. Next slide, please. So as Marlon's comments suggest, there are racial disparities regarding attitudes about the criminal justice system. So for example, in an August 2020 Gallup poll, only 19% of African Americans express having confidence in police compared to 56% of white adults. In that same poll, 1 out of 10 African Americans express having no confidence in the criminal justice system. And so again, this speaks to ineffective policing. And we can see further evidence of this if we look at arrest rates that reveal that fewer violent crimes are being solved today, from as high as 90% in 1960 to currently around 60%. More importantly, killers of Black victims, who make up a disproportionate amount of homicide events, are also the least likely to be arrested. Next slide, please. So from our study, we found that members of high-risk communities want officers to be empathetic, to show kindness, and not to open otherwise routine encounters with inflammatory profanity and aggression, such as unlawfully rifling through detainees' belongings. Our respondents put it succinctly. They wanted officers to safeguard the futures of the children in low-income neighborhoods as they would their own. So again, in speaking about the simultaneous over and under policing that we witnessed, we can again point to clearance rates for violent crimes. So in 2015, less than 10% of non-fatal shootings in Durham, North Carolina resulted in arrest. In 2016, the San Francisco Police Department cleared only 15% of its gun assaults. In 2016, the Chicago Police Department cleared less than 12% of non-fatal shootings. And in 2017, 1 in 10 non-fatal shootings were cleared in New Orleans. Next slide, please. So all of this should factor into our discussions about defunding the police and shifting resources away from police departments. Because we should recognize that defunding the police will not address longstanding social problems that we find in high crime communities. For example, residents of high crime communities routinely complain about ineffective policing, including officers' rudeness, slow response time, and lack of compassion for shooting victims. Ineffective or decreased policing leads to a small subset of chronic offenders who are willing to discard the criminal justice system entirely and take matters into their own hands. So when we think about reform, city leaders should embrace strategies that have been proposed, which enlist the help of community partners, who have expertise in training that officers might lack, such as crisis intervention, mental health, homelessness, and substance abuse. So we talk about defunding the police, it doesn't mean the same to everyone, and certainly isn't implemented in every jurisdiction similarly. So for example, one county might shift financial resources from the public safety budget to community stakeholders, and another might carelessly raid the police budget, further undermining agencies already struggling to meet public safety obligations. The first scenario considers how to best reallocate limited resources, prioritizing persistent crime and disorder problems. Defunding the police may also inadvertently sanction age-old structural inequality, and that is that police agencies that are serving low crime, affluent communities will continue to enjoy healthy operating budgets, and poor people living in high crime neighborhoods will have to live with the consequences of defunding the police. Next slide, please. So as I also mentioned in the introduction, I want to shift to the third part of my comments today. I want to talk a little bit about a study that I intend to undertake in Chicago. So a recent analysis by the University of Chicago Crime Lab underscores that despite containing just 7.4% of Chicago's population, 5 communities in the city accounted for 28% of all 2019 homicides, and the concentration of violence worsened in 2020. Like other cities, a handful of perpetrators in geographical areas generate a sizable amount of gun violence in Chicago, and in particular, young Black men who are often involved in street gangs and crews are overrepresented as both shooting offenders and victims. Unfortunately, law-abiding Chicago residents of the aforementioned 5 neighborhoods are not spared the resulting trauma and strains on their quality of life as a result of this episodic violence. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So as the figures show, this pattern of clustered gun violence has proven stable over time. That is, the 5 neighborhoods represent 29% of fatal and 30% of non-fatal shootings over the past 5 years. Next slide. So I plan to use a holistic qualitative approach to highlight the lived experiences of those most at risk for gun violence, both victims and perpetrators, as well as enlisting the voices of embattled neighborhood residents who sometimes gloomily report feeling like prisoners in their own home. So I seek to do this by interviewing 125 study participants across the 5 neighborhoods, 50 law-abiding and 75 high-risk individuals. The planned research has the potential to capture the complexity, the nuance, and the wide range of public safety perceptions and experiences that are contained within and across distressed neighborhood setting. The proposed work will generate detailed descriptions of policy problems that help to shape scalable interventions and solutions. It is my hope that these findings will be released through a range of deliverables, including podcasts, blogs, research, policy brief, white papers, multi-year grant proposals, and public presentations to local policymakers and community stakeholders. So I welcome comments from those of you who I know are highly engaged in this work and have years of experience conducting this research. I welcome your suggestions and any questions you may have for me. And thank you so much for your time. I've enjoyed the opportunity and privilege to present to this group. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Brunson. That was an exceptional talk. And I just want to remind folks who are watching to please put any questions that you have in the Q&A so that we can use them in this portion of the discussion. So we already have a few questions that have come in, and I'll start by asking, you talked a lot and eloquently about the need for police reform. I'm curious what you see as the key challenges to that reform.
I think one of the key challenges is that we haven't had honest and thoughtful discussions. And I think that certainly this issue has been politicized, no surprise. But also, the police unions have a role to play. And I think that we should have them at the table as opposed to being adversaries and feeling under attack. And again, I believe, and from my research, that police have a vital role to play, and we should have thoughtful conversations about how they, in collaboration with others, can continue to serve in a more effective way their public safety roles.
Great, thank you for that. One of the questions that's come in over the Q&A, those of us who are in the healthcare community, there's a lot of work to develop violence interventions and other things through the healthcare setting. I'm curious what you see as opportunities for the criminal justice community and the healthcare communities to work together in terms of firearm violence reduction. And then what you see as the potential for the mistrust of police then potentially negatively affecting the role that healthcare providers have to play in that.
Yeah, I know a lot of that important work has been done by, currently underway in facts. And so several interdisciplinary collaborations, which I certainly think is the most productive way for us to go forward. I think it's also a recognition that people who live in, and not that this group doesn't understand this, but we need to kind of drive this point home to the general public, that when we see the portrayals of community violence, and then we hear the narrative that people don't come forward, and then the conclusion drawn is that law-abiding people who live in this community, or people who live in these communities, are accepting and tolerant of the violence. And I think that we need to work to change that narrative and to understand that people have real world reasons for not coming forward, and that their safety is paramount to them as well as it is to most of us. And that we need to make these communities objectively safer so that people will feel more comfortable coming forward and providing critical information to the police, because they don't want to live under these conditions either. And we just can't blame them for not, sacrificing their family's well-being to not provide that information. As relates to healthcare workers, again, I know that many of your colleagues are on the front lines of seeing the effects of community violence, and just having that, again, recognition that when people don't provide information, it's not that they, in some cases, certainly they want to settle it themselves, or they're not seeking any criminal justice system remedies. But we also need to provide opportunities for people to provide information in ways that they can continue to be safe, or they can be safe and their families can be safe, and not just in our frustration throw our hands up.
Interesting. There's a number of questions that have come in around this concept of sort of defunding the police, and so I'm curious. Your thoughts on sort of in the light of these mounting calls to defund the police, what role do you think that police have in reducing gun violence? And then sort of a parallel question that is along that lines is that one person asked, in 35 of the 50 largest US cities, police department budgets have grown to be the largest municipal budget line. And sort of within that, what one or two items could be redirected to address sort of this question of defunding the police, but actually investing really more in safety, as you kind of talked about, and especially in communities that have been affected by structural racism and disinvestment?
Yeah, those are great questions. I think one of the things that we need to, as a society, as a general public, we need to better understand how police spend their times. And so how they spend time, executing their duties. And when we think about those budgets, maybe police, budgets are in some jurisdictions bloated, and others, they don't have enough resources. But interesting paper that my colleague Cynthia Lum and others out of George Mason actually conducted a study of a number of police departments using call for service as a measurement, and how much time that officers were spending on these calls. And so, contrary probably to popular belief, the vast majority of calls were around traffic accidents or, traffic enforcement, or the types of calls that aren't necessarily immediate and aren't necessarily going to result in arrest or stopping violence. But these are, considerable time investments. So we need to understand what police are doing, what we as a community want police to do, how we want them to use those resources that they've been entrusted with more appropriately. And again, being welcome to collaborating with others who have expertise and training that they may not have to shift some of those responsibilities and many of the duties that police may not want to do or are ill-equipped to do. So it may not be a simple matter of transferring resources or withholding resources from police departments, but making them more accountable as relates to how they're using those resources.
Interesting. A couple of questions about the data that you talked about. As any data on the race or ethnicity of the police officers and officer involved shootings?
I don't believe that exists. And if it does exist, and I know that there have been, there have been studies that have looked at this. And I think one of the challenges, as I mentioned, is that we don't have a standardized nationwide database. And so we're kind of, at the mercy of police agencies that decide to report, and whether or not this data is being systematically collected and whether or not we're mandating the reporting of that data. So I won't say that there aren't studies, but I will call again that we need to have systematic, nationwide, standardized collection of this data so that we can do systematic and rigorous analysis.
Just piggybacking on that, is it simply a matter of mandating that data be collected, or are there other ways to improve the quality of the data? Because I know you spoke a lot about the quality being pretty low.
Yeah, I think we have, we can and we should do both. We should mandate the reporting, but we should also say this is how, the data should be, should be sent or compiled. And certainly we learn along the way when there are things that we'd like to know that we don't know. Maybe better quality of data as well, but not to just make it voluntary and who knows what form it comes in. And certainly, we shouldn't, we're thankful, but we shouldn't, the Washington Post shouldn't be responsible, for gathering and analyzing this data by themselves.
Sure, that's a very good point. I'm curious, there's a lot of discussion around police not living in the communities that they serve, and if you could speak a little bit to the data on the effect that has, or sort of counter to that, the effect that it has when police do live in high numbers in the communities that they serve, are mandated to live in those communities.
Yeah, and again, a lot of this has been, there have been studies that have examined whether police residency requirements have an impact on reduced crime or improved quality of life. And I'll speak anecdotally about some agencies that I have been involved with and have had these conversations. And what happens in some cities, which is somewhat understandable, is that police, firefighters, and other municipal workers gravitate towards certain parts of the city, and those places are not the places that are probably most in need of initiatives and reforms to address violence. So so my caution is that if we mandate these types of residency requirements, we may make certain parts of the city safer, but the parts of the city that are most in need of attention as relates to violent crime, those aren't necessarily going to be the places where, and I'm not saying that the police should, but they're not going to be the places where people, are most desirable to people who are looking to relocate their families, et cetera. So if there is some shared benefit of us as a society making those places less violent, and because there's a societal benefit to us all by doing that.
Great. One final question. So I'm curious your thoughts on how, you touched maybe a little bit on this already, but how community stakeholders and police can work together towards improved public safety.
Yeah. Again, it goes back to willingness to have people at the table who, and I'll say from the standpoint of city administrators and police leaders, et cetera, to work with people in groups that they may be uncomfortable working with, whether they've had past political dust ups or whatever. But we need to have, it's such a serious problem. And again, not to I don't have to say this to this group, but that we can't afford to have petty differences and political differences when there's so much work that we have to do to improve the lives and conditions for our fellow citizens. And so I would say to kind of put aside some of those, longstanding and perhaps legitimate kind of risks that exist, but to bring everyone to the table and to enlist the help of all these community stakeholders and say everyone has an equally important role to play. But that also comes back to, we can't say that everybody has the equally important role to play, but some people have more financial resources available to them. So I do believe that there does call for reconsidering how budget priorities are laid out and who has control of those resources, et cetera.
Thank you so much for that. And I think that wraps up our Q&A portion. I do want to thank you, Dr. Brunson, for your talk and for answering all these questions. I hope that next year we'll get to see you in person at the conference instead of doing this virtually.